Okay, good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everyone, depending on where in the world you are. And a very warm welcome to our 7th webinar in our Post-2020 series on local and subnational governments. It's fantastic to be here at the 7th webinar. And I'm mindful of the fact that it's about almost exactly a year until the COP in Kunming. So we are very excited, and it's been a great year as we have continued to advocate for a stronger role for local and subnationals. And perhaps I can take this opportunity just to thank everyone for their continued support. We have a really exciting webinar planned for today, and we're going to do things slightly differently. Before I get into the detail, I just want to say that this webinar will be recorded and uploaded as the others have been to the Cities with Nature YouTube channel, where it will be made available to everyone publicly. All of the documents and resources that are referenced in this webinar will also be made available, and the recording of the webinar along with those resources will be shared to all those who have registered. I should also mention that at the end of the webinar, when we open for some discussion and questions, any attendee is welcome to contribute or to ask a question to any of the panelists. And there are two ways in which this can be done. Both happen on the panel on the right of your screen. You can either raise your hand and we will call on you to speak, or you can post a question in the question box. And please note that those questions in the question box can actually be addressed specifically to a panelist. So I think without further ado, we can get started. The webinar today is a really a panel discussion on shaping the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework in the context of the pivotal role of local and subnational governments. And the reason why today will be slightly different is rather than having many presenters fill the time, we are really thrilled to have Harriet Balkley with us, joining us, and she is going to join us on a panel with Kobie Brandt. So I will introduce Harriet in more detail later on. But before we get into this really exciting panel discussion, Kobie is going to provide us an update on the 10-point framework and the local and subnational government position paper. So just to situate ourselves and where we are along the roadmap, you'll recognize this slide from every webinar. But you can see we are at webinar 7 at the end of October, and you can see that we're coming up to some really exciting things. We've had a Ramsar meeting in September. We have hopefully the UNFCCC in December, the COP, as well as SABSA 23, which will happen in Montreal in November, and where we will be well represented. So I just wanted to mention something before we move on, something that's happened very recently, and one of our own, Ingrid Coetzee, has represented us at the International Conference on Urban Ecosystems and Nature-Based Solutions, which was held in Beijing on the 29th of October, so a few days ago, and was organized by ICLEI in collaboration with the SCBD and commissioned by the German Federal Agency for Nature Conservation with funding from the German Federal Ministry for the Environment. And I have had a very brief update from Ingrid that the event was fantastic and consisted of a number of different plenaries and roundtables, each discussing thematic focus areas around nature and biodiversity. And just to mention now in brief that the conference concluded with report backs from the 4 roundtables, and these report backs will be captured as submissions to the Post-2020 Framework consultation process. And there will be more on this to come in our next webinar, in the 8th webinar, where Ingrid will provide a bit more detail on that event. But that was one of the exciting things that have happened in the last week. So I'm going to hand over now to Ms. Kobie Brandt. She is our Regional Director of ICLEI Africa and the Director of ICLEI's Global Cities Biodiversity Center. And Kobie, thank you for joining us today. It's always wonderful to have you and your insight. And Kobie is going to provide us with a bit of an update on the 10-point framework and position paper. So over to you, Kobie.
Thank you very much, Timothy. And yeah, let me just first of all say to everybody who's joined, I'm very happy World Cities Day. We are celebrating World Cities Day with some really nice cake here in the office, and also with with a great campaign that you can follow on Cities with Nature and on the ICLEI different websites, particularly the ICLEI Cities Biodiversity Centre website, where we've uploaded an article this morning, important announcements. Very glad to say that today we are announcing that we've reached the 100th mark already, and I think we've gone beyond it today already, of cities signing up and starting to engage very actively in the Cities with Nature platform, which is of course a free and open platform for all cities and other levels of subnational governments. I'm also happy to say that side by side to the Cities with Nature platform, there will be a Regions with Nature platform that we will introduce in the next months. And then levels of different subnational governments would be able to choose whether they want to enter the collective big tent that we're building with all our partners, including IUCN, TNC, WWF, and many others, whether they want to enter it through the Cities with Nature or through the Regions with Nature platforms. But having said that, why I'm saying that is, why I'm mentioning Cities with Nature is that it is significant that Cities with Nature has been recognized by the CBD Secretariat as the point of ground truthing, basically the reporting depository really for cities and other subnational governments in terms of the actions they take, the ambitions they have, the goals they set, and the progress they make around mainstreaming nature and nature-based solutions into their constituencies as independent levels of government. So this brings me, I'm going to take us roughly through the 10-point framework. And what I want to say about the 10-point framework is that it's not a formal position yet. We are getting inputs at the moment from groups of local and subnational governments, from individual cities, from individual scientists, and also from groups of scientists and other international organizations. It's really an open process. We are also speaking to parties, to nations about this, and everybody's welcome to contribute to our thought processes as they develop into a statement that could be a representative statement on behalf of subnational and local governments going into the post-2020 biodiversity discussions that are now picking up speed quite nicely. So we presented the outline of this 10-point framework at the first open-ended working group, which is one of the formal preparatory engagement processes of the CBD in Nairobi, just about a month or two ago. And since then we've gotten quite a lot of input, and it's very nice to see how it's taking shape and being enriched by these inputs. And we hope that when we get to the second open-ended working group in February in Kunming in China, ICLEI again with partners like Regions 4, and hopefully with the backing of a much larger constituency of partners by then, will present again this framework, or again it will then hopefully be more in the form of a first or zero draft position statement on behalf of our constituency. What's important about this statement is that it should be turned into, it should inspire nations and parties who actually are going to draft the decision for the post-2020 framework to make sure that they take notice of what we are saying as a collective voice, and also hopefully agree that a strong dedicated decision on local and subnational governments is needed as part of the post-2020 GBF or Global Biodiversity Framework. So Why develop the framework? I've really spoken about this again, but just bullet number 3 there points to the 10-year plan of action on subnational governments, cities and other local authorities for biodiversity. That's the long title. It was adopted in Nagoya by the parties at the CBD COP10, and it was a 10-year plan of action. So this also comes to an end in 2020. The parties agreed for the first time ever on not only recognizing the role of local and subnational governments, but on strengthening and capacitating and enabling the voices and the role and the actions that need to happen at the local and subnational government. And that decision has really stood us in very good course, because from that, a number of new initiatives, new groups, individual initiatives by cities, as well as tools and programs like Cities with Nature, etc., all found its home in that decision. So it's very important that when this decision now comes to an end in 2020, that something else replaces it. And if you go and have a look at that decision, it's decision 1022 of the COP, you will note that it basically is something that we can really build on. We want to see stronger language. The world has moved on in the last 10 years, remarkably so, if you look at the language used in that decision and what we should be calling for now responsibly. So it's that what we should be calling for now that these dialogues are meant to inform us on. So looking at the 10-point framework, again, it's got 10 essential aspects. We're not set on a 10-point framework. It could be less, it could be more. We can drop the number. That's irrelevant. We just, when we worked with a couple of cities and other partners to start structuring the first draft, it nicely turned out into 10 points, but I mean, we don't have to stick to that at all. As I said, that was already presented at the open-ended working group, and inputs are being made now. The next edition or rendition of it will be taken to Substa 23 in November in Montreal, and then of course to Kunming in February 2020. So what are these 10 points that we're talking to? They're not yet in the format or the language of a statement. They're more informative points that we need to make sure we capture into a strong statement. And the first one is around multi-level governance. The need for multi-level governance, especially when you look at managing nature, if you look at providing corridors, etc., you cannot look at cadastral boundaries of local governments, or and yeah, I mean, even at international level, I would say, you know, one cannot look at country boundaries anymore when you look at how you're going to manage and preserve and enhance our nature-based systems on which we all depend. So that multi-level governance is extremely important, and ICLEI is in the good position that we often find ourselves in a matchmaking position where we are, as a neutral and trusted partner, can work with countries like we're doing right today in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, where we bring all the levels of government together who do not often have the opportunity to come together around a specific project around nature. Today we're launching our Dar es Salaam Nature Value Asset map, and that's also a big achievement for us, because every level of government had a very key and pivotal role to play in coming together in terms of evaluating and putting on paper the value of nature in and around the city of Dar es Salaam. So the second one is around inclusive and action-oriented mainstreaming. And here one's talking about the inclusivity that is needed, and that actually one should not look upon nature as something secondary to some of the other global challenges, but it is fundamental to be addressed when one looks at the other global challenges all around us, including climate, but certainly also related to some of the social challenges and risks around IT, artificial intelligence, all these things really have to be connected somehow to the planetary boundaries within which we live. The third point is about the need for both increased national and local investment in biodiversity and nature-based solutions. The fourth point goes directly into external investment needs to nature, and that talks to the private sector and other development aid. But point number 3 is extremely important because we know that the national fiscus in a country is still much bigger than development aid for the developing world, and that national governments can, and we say should, be rethinking how they prioritize and how they budget, and how they cost nature's services, and that full cost analysis and that sort of thing. You know, the natural capital accounting processes, all these things come in here. But then we also say local governments need to rethink how they prioritize biodiversity and nature. It's often the stepchild, it's often the one without a department, without staff, without resources, and it's often the nice to have. If we have money left, we will give a little bit to our parks or whatever. And here I'm making a very general statement, of course. Not all cities are like that, and we know of many cities who are really mainstreaming nature in all their decision making. But for many cities still, that penny needs to drop. And I think the argument needs to be made stronger why it is wise and cost saving and absolutely necessary for all levels of government to actually invest in nature and nature-based solutions for the many, many multiple benefits and diverse benefits that arrive from it. Point number 4, I've spoken to a large extent. So I'm not going to hammer on that. We know that we need to work more closely with the private sector, and Harriet, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on developments there. And the whole development aid world, we see that there is an uptake for nature, but it is not at the level that it should be. It is not at the level that other agendas get attention, and even those agendas, the links are not made as strongly as it should be. And that brings me to point number 6 here. I'm skipping 5 just for a second. Another important point that we say is that the city is can be seen almost as a nexus in itself, where everything comes together. The interconnectivity of the global challenges and the systemic nature of how they influence our lives and the systemic solutions that we need to seek here really need to come out strongly. So the interconnectedness of with other global agendas is extremely important. And to this end, I just want to say that you know, platforms like COPs for other conventions like the climate COP is very important. We know this year it's a troublesome situation with Chile just announcing yesterday that they will not be holding the COP or hosting the COP anymore, because it's at platforms like these where these different agendas can actually come closer together. And we've seen it happening over the last couple of years, and it's really rewarding to see how specifically the nature and climate agendas are starting to find each other. Number 5 talks about really for the world to understand the multiple social benefits of mainstreaming nature at subnational level, and the multiple benefits. It's not only the health benefits, but also the connectivity benefits, the creative aspects of life, the fulfillment of a quality of life in the urban century, etc. That cannot happen. There's a statement I heard the other day of somebody talking about one cannot build thriving economies and thriving social communities on bankrupt ecosystems. And never better is this manifested than at the local level in cities and in towns where we work every day. Number 7 speaks to the knowledge, science and research element. This is very important. We know that data is lacking and that it's often not consistent, the different data sets that we do get hold of. It's anecdotal, which is very valuable in itself, but somehow we're not in a space yet where this knowledge and research is really informing decision making across the board at the local level. And we are, as we've said over the last couple of years as a constituency, we need to see more investment and more uptake from the science community on this topic, and also support towards the science community to take up these research areas that are so ill-informed in many places. So we're looking at global solutions, but we're also looking at national and really downscale solutions for getting better data and better knowledge and research informing decisions. And then point number 8 is just the consumption patterns, talking about the need and the urgency for lifestyle changes, living within the planetary boundaries, etc. And I think I've spoken enough about that. Number 9 is that is really a strong call for a clear decision that will replace the previous plan of action, decision 1022 I referred to earlier. Something else needs to come in its place. We've seen since decision 1022 consecutive decisions and referrals in the decisions to local and subnational governments in every single COP, which is of course fantastic and very much welcomed by our entire constituency. But it was within the framework of knowing that there's this holding space, this collective holding space, the plan of action. And that plan of action needs to be replaced with something stronger, bolder, and dedicated. That does not mean that we would not advocate for mainstreaming the local and subnational context into as many decisions as needed of the post-2020 agreement. And number 10, and I'm ending with this here, is the need for a reporting and monitoring system. Like in the climate world, we need an MRV system where cities are starting or are able to put forward their targets, their aims, their goals, their aspirations, and then also measure themselves against how they progress along these targets. This will provide a body of knowledge, a wealth of knowledge and information that can be used and analyzed by our science friends, and that could inform the global community in terms of the actual contribution that cities are and could and should be making towards redressing the state of nature that we find out the world in today. So I think that reporting platform is something that we would like to have strengthened and institutionalized more, and that parties would rally behind something like that. At the moment, I mentioned that we've got the Cities with Nature and soon also the Regions with Nature platform, which are endorsed as such platforms, but they need more work. They need more people, more energy, more resources to really turn them into these global effective platforms. So with that, I thank you and I hand back to Timothy.
Great, thank you so much, Kobie. It's always wonderful to get your perspective, and thanks for providing us with the update on the 10-point framework. And I think the point 10 on Cities with Nature and the types of commitments and targets that that cities are making leads very nicely into my introduction to Harriet Bulkley, because ICLEI is working very closely with Harriet on the development of the Cities with Nature commitment platform, and Harriet has done some exciting work there, which she will tell us about now. But Harriet is a professor of geography at Durham University and the project coordinator for the H2020 Smart Cities and Communities program called Natureation. So Harriet, welcome, and it's so great to have you on the line. Harriet is a close friend of ICLEI's and really an expert in the field. So at this point, we're going to go into a bit of an informal panel discussion between Harriet and Kobie that I will moderate, although I will probably keep my talking to a minimum because there's lots to discuss. So Harriet, I wonder if you would maybe just open by just letting us know some of the work that you do through Naturevation and your research at Durham, and perhaps some of I mean, you are someone who really has your ear to the ground, so maybe some of the emerging schools of thought that you are involved in or aware of around, maybe we should start around the mobilization and the action agenda. So I wonder if I could hand over to you now, Harriet.
Thank you, Tim. And yeah, good morning, everybody here from Durham, where it's a rather cool and cloudy morning, but there's plenty of beautiful nature outside of the window, so we're enjoying that today. Yeah, as I was saying, thank you very much for inviting me into the seminar. I think Naturevation, the project that I'm leading, we're 3 years through the work that we've been doing now, and I think we're just coming to the stage where we really got a lot of exciting things to share. I think one of the key things that we can say, we've been working on how cities, particularly in Europe, but also looking globally, how cities are working with nature, or what in the European Union we often call nature-based solutions, to address their sustainable development challenges. And I can firmly suggest that nature-based solutions and working with nature is something that a great number of cities are now doing. They might not always formalize this in their plans. It may be more project-based, it may be more an add-on to other policies and projects that they're doing, but there is a huge amount of activity going on. So to try to capture some of this, we've designed something we call the Urban Nature Atlas, and we've recorded 1,000 different examples of actions that cities are taking, real projects happening in the last 5 years, some, most of them still current, where cities are really trying to use nature around sustainable development goals. And the good news about that is we also find through our analysis that many of the projects that are taking place are really focusing on questions around biodiversity. At least a third of the projects that we've looked at have biodiversity goals essential to what they're trying to achieve. And we assume that many of the other projects are also making a contribution to biodiversity goals, even if that's not so clearly articulated. And what we've been trying to think about as we look at this work is, what is it that these cities are really trying to achieve for biodiversity? And we think we can come down to sort of really 3 kind of key and quite simple messages: that cities are working to protect biodiversity, they're working to restore it, and they're working to realize the benefits of nature for their own communities, so what we would call thriving with nature. We're going to see all sorts of different examples of that taking place. So that's really exciting to be able to have that evidence base now that really shows that cities are taking a huge range of actions towards that. And also, Kobe, to pick up on one of the last things that you just said, that those are goals that they are writing down in measurable, verifiable ways. So cities are coming up with their own kind of measurable and verifiable targets for the actions that they're taking. And I think it's going to be important as we go forward that we understand the kinds of targets that cities are already adopting, and that we make sure that we can harness those towards these global goals.
Absolutely. Great, Harriet. Thanks for that introduction. And it's certainly exciting to see the work that's coming out and to learn about the types of commitments that cities are making. And I know that, a lot of this work has informed your input to the sort of commitment platform that we're trying to get up and running. So I wonder if you would maybe just talk to that for a minute on perhaps how some of your inputs were structured around the IP base, and also picking up really strongly, I think, on the linkages between the biodiversity agenda and the other more broad sustainable development goals and whatnot.
Yeah, well, so many people will remember the IPBES report. It was released in April, though that does, in the biodiversity world, seem quite a long time ago now. The pace of action and momentum is really building. But in that very detailed, comprehensive report, cities get really quite a lot of airtime, if you like. They're really in the focus of a lot of the report. But for much of the discourse is really about how cities are a problem for biodiversity. And I think it's really important that we recognize that, of course, but at the same time, we need to sort of shift the dial a bit towards what are the opportunities that cities provide for addressing biodiversity. And I think that really resonates with some of the previous points Kobe was mentioning as well. And towards that end, we went through the IPBES report to see what are the opportunities here, where could cities contribute towards the goals that IPBES say we need to be pursuing, and those are about the drivers of biodiversity loss, but they're also about how cities can provide a really important space for engaging with communities around their values for biodiversity, their critical space around issues around consumption. They're vital sites where we realize the benefits of nature for society, not only locally but globally. So we use that kind of input as well as our own analysis to kind of think about how we could create this kind of simple platform where cities could sign up to saying how they're working to protect nature, how they're working to restore it, or how they're working to thrive with nature. And we think that this could have some traction. And then more recently, some of you listening in may have seen the short video that Greta and George produced for the New York Climate Summit Week, which echoed some of those key messages as well about the importance of protecting nature and restoring it. But yeah, so we think that that could provide a really strong basis for an action agenda that could unite a whole set of actors from the business community as well as also at the regional level, without basically trying to capture what cities are already doing and push that forward rather than reinventing the wheel, I think will be important. But I think, you know, to come to your question, Tim, about the status of the action agenda, I think it's clear that cities and business actors and financial organizations and agricultural cooperatives and a huge range of other societal actors have, since the IPBES report was published in particular, but even before then, started to gather momentum, wanting to take things forward. But at the moment, there seems to be some question and potentially a lack of leadership coming from within the wider biodiversity governance community about how far the action agenda is really going to be taken forward. So this was the action agenda agreed in the summit at Sharm el-Sheikh. And there seems to be a bit of a concern that that has gone a bit quiet. So, and potentially also linked into some concerns that are being raised in relationship to the next iteration of the post-Paris agreement in the climate arena as well, as to, there's some concern there that the large push that there was in Paris towards the inclusion of all these other actors, when it comes up for a renewal in 2020, there doesn't seem to be as much political momentum at high levels within the climate regime, also towards the further inclusion of non-state actors. So I think there's from a research and community perspective, from colleagues who are watching the climate process and the biodiversity process, there is maybe a concern that there's a little bit of a shutting down of the interest in supporting non-state actors in these processes. And I think that's something that we need to be careful about and concerned about, and making sure that we're continuing to push the fact that we need these wider platforms, as well as a decision within the COP. We need these wider platforms in which these actions of these different organizations can really be valued.
Yeah. Great, thanks, Harriet. And I think you've touched on an important point that Kirby actually would like to respond to. So Kirby, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Harriet. And yeah, absolutely. And there are a couple of points I'd like us to have a long conversation about, of course, and I'm hoping we'll have the chance over the coming months, but to unpack these things in more detail. But on the point of the voice of the non-state actors, you know, here we have, I think, ICLEI and our other city networks and our pioneering cities and regions have really made strides within the UN community for them to recognize. First of all, we were grouped with the NGO grouping, you know, and so cities were saying they're not NGOs, and states were saying they're not NGOs, they're independent levels of government. And so there are governments in their own right making executive decisions on a daily basis. And many of these decisions that they're taking on a daily basis, specifically if you can imagine around land use planning and sort of master planning and that sort of thing, very, very directly impact on nature. And actually, you know, they're either climate sensitive or they're not, or they're either climate smart or not. So at these levels of government, executive decisions are made, and therefore they should be recognized as governments in their own right in these discussions. And we see that specifically the CBD Secretariat has been open to this idea. And I think if you look at the statement also that came out, and we can share that statement, Tim, with all the participants, that was issued late last night by the Executive Secretary of the CBD on the eve of World Cities Day. You know, it's very clear that they do recognize local and subnational governments as governments. And it was actually enlightening to see that no less than 17 parties came out in the open-ended working group 1, which happened in Nairobi some 2 months ago, in favor of speaking strongly for local and subnational governments and cities and whatever, you know, they name us different things, but the essence is there. They want to see us very much embedded in their decisions. So at the CBD, within the CBD space, I think we feel that that has been achieved. It's been a milestone, because 10 years ago, you would have had 1 or 2 friendly states that would have, or parties that would have mentioned and spoken about local and subnational governments in such a direct way. But here we see the EU, the ASEAN group, and then a whole lot of very strong individual parties in the convention coming out, speaking out, and recognizing us as a government constituency. So I think that is important, but I completely agree that there needs to be a concerted effort in terms of platforms, and being a hanger-on to the COPs isn't enough. It's not good enough. It's important to be there, and it's important to work with the parties in a multi-level government fashion for us, but at the same time, cities and subnational governments have their own platforms where we engage not only between ourselves, but also with all the very important stakeholders, including the business community, including civil society, including research and academia, etc. And one event that's coming up now that I just want to alert everybody to is in about a week's time, we will have the UCLG Global Summit. That's going to take place in Durban here in my country, in South Africa. And part of the proceedings is a very high-level engagement on biodiversity, whereas this is the first time that nature and biodiversity altogether is featured on that program. So we see many more strong, important role players coming to the table and uniting behind these advocacy and dialogue processes. We're not there yet, but I think we certainly can see over the last 5 years, I can certainly see a momentum building in the positive direction. But this is speaking from a nature perspective. But having said that, we're not nearly where the climate world is at. And as you're pointing out, in the climate world, you know, we're not where we want to be either. So it's small steps, whereas I think the world needs us to take big, bold, brave steps at the moment. And that's why I think with this decision or this position that we as a constituency need to send out to the world and influence the dialogues is ever more important. I'd like to know if, Harriet, from a scientific community, if you see perhaps a collective statement coming out that could be from an analytical scientific point of view, almost back a more political statement from our constituency with the data and the facts and the evidence, or do you reported on a myriad of initiatives and discussions and so on that's going on? Do you think there is going to be something that's going to that can bind it together, or is that a role that we can maybe try and play such a coordinating role? Because I think such a statement from the world of science would greatly benefit the more political statement that will come from our members, our cities and regions.
I think that's a really interesting suggestion, Kobe. I think there are definitely discussions going on about whether a sort of second version of a kind of local biodiversity assessment or a local biodiversity science report or something of this kind would be useful. And so I think that would be useful to consider. There are some different things that could go into that kind of statement. There's growing evidence about the actual ecological, social, cultural contribution that nature in cities is making. A number of different projects are now developing new assessment tools and indices and natural capital assessments of the contribution that nature-based solutions are making to sustainable development goals. So a number of those assessments will be probably ready by the summer next year. So that might be a good thing to collect those. And then there is the kind of science and the evidence about what it takes to get urban nature policies, programs and projects to work on the ground. And I think there's a growing body of evidence about that as well. So a combination of that kind of, if you like, more natural science perspective with a more social science perspective could be useful. I think one of the other things where we're really seeing a growth in the evidence base now is around the value that nature has in cities. So within our own project, we're developing a new kind of value function for urban nature, and we're trialing that at the moment. We hope that will be ready in the spring. But that's attracting quite a lot of interest from the business and the financing communities, who, of course, usually want to know, the value of something in monetary terms. And much as we may, and myself and my own kind of approach to nature is that I don't like to put a price on it. Sometimes I think that's a useful thing for us to have to do, as long as we caveat it sufficiently to say it's not to capture the whole of the value of nature. So working with the business community and the financial investment community, I think we are going to also need to go in that direction to a certain degree, while being very cautious about the kinds of values that that kind of method can't capture. So yeah, there are those sort of three streams, if you like, of work that are emerging that could be collected. I think it would probably be the spring or summer before it would be usefully done. But so it depends a little bit on whether, how that fits with the kind of timeline that you see of when that evidence would be needed. It may be that before that, more individual pieces of research evidence are available, but a kind of collective would need to take that a little bit longer.
But I think both would be needed. I think as these things come available, we should feed it into our process and make it available. And I would appeal to you, Harriet, and any other scientists and people working within this field to really reach to us, because Tim is going to just say one thing about the roadmap platform, a depository platform. So the individual pieces will already be very useful, I think, to cities and regions to take note of. But perhaps spring is, by then, the decision, the COP decision, the Post-2020 framework would pretty much be almost drafted. So we would need to have a decision sort of on the table by the parties by then, so we need to influence before then. But at the same time, it could be very powerful to come out with a collective assessment of the learnings of the last few years collectively and present that at the COP as well,
Good. So it's sounding to me, as though there's a lot of things happening in the space, in the scientific community, the business community, finance, certainly in the realm of local and subnational governments. And I think this is leading quite nicely to our sort of core question here today, which is really around, and Kubi touched on it as one of the 10 points at this point 9, around this dedicated decision. And Harriet, I wonder if you would want to just respond briefly to that, whether, what are your thoughts on the sort of need to replace the decision that was made in Nagoya? And what would this decision look like? I think that's the sort of burning question. How do we bring all of these things together to really sort of strengthen the policy ask as a collective, certainly moments next year?
Yeah. Thanks, Tim. Yes, I think that this area is really, it's both ripe for advancing, as Kobe said, it's 10 years. There's definitely, the landscape has changed and the decision needs to be updated to reflect that. I think there's a really something of a tension here between a decision that overly specifies what it is that cities should do and a decision that seeks to enable and capacitate them to take their own action towards nature. And I think treading that line will be very challenging, but it's probably what needs to happen. So one of our findings in the project is that how cities are actually implementing their strategies and approaches towards nature in cities can take maybe 12 more different modes of governing. So as well as being multiple in as well as being multi-level, it's multiple in its approaches. And that is often because of all the different kinds of partnerships that are required, partnerships with civil society, with business, with financial organizations, partnerships with utilities and other organizations. So we really see there isn't a kind of one size fits all. And I suppose what I would be kind of encouraging is trying to have a decision that is really about recognizing that cities are a vital part of the solution, but that they must have what they need is to be given the capacity to drive their policies and their governance approaches in the ways that really work for that city on the ground.
And the mandates that come along with it, you know.
Exactly. So some of these are official mandates, but often what we see in terms of what cities are acting on biodiversity and nature are their mandates to work with others. They're more about their enabling powers, their convening powers, their powers as representatives of communities, their powers as leaders, as well as their formal legal and regulatory powers. And so I suppose what I'm suggesting is that the decision needs to reflect that wide variety of powers and responsibilities and roles that local governments have, to make sure that all of those different kinds of capacities are recognized as vital to achieving that outcome. And that, I think, will be difficult to get into formal language for the convention, which is very much more focused on the kind of official powers and regulation. So it may be that you need a decision within the convention, which is about the formal, the regulatory, the mandated powers, and then something more in the kind of opening blurb that, as there is, for example, in the Paris Agreement, which recognizes the roles of cities and other actors working together towards these outcomes, which gives a wider remit. And I think within the Paris Agreement has certainly been one of the things which has driven business action, driven partnerships, has been that kind of, okay, we are recognized as legitimate actors. We may not have formal mandates and roles, but we are legitimate. And so it may be that there needs to be two different kind of parts of the convention, one where the legitimacy of a whole range of action is seen, and one where the formal regulatory planning mandated powers of subnational governments in this arena are recognized and protected. And then of course the capacity building one as well, Kobe, just to finish, is that it's got to be clear that a role for all of the other parties is to provide capacity for subnational government. Yeah,
and I think these are not mutually exclusive, and I think where they are needed, we agree. And you know, a dedicated decision to replace the plan of action certainly should not be seen as the only achievement we would like to see coming out, you know, for cities. But it's certainly the holding space, the formal holding space, and then one would like to see mainstreamed mention and recognition throughout the rest of the decision as well. And there could be, perhaps, I mean, this is something one could plant the idea with parties. Of course, it's not in our hands, but you know, that they could describe cities as these a city as a nexus, a city as a meeting point, a city as an enabler, you know, and a fast tracker, and a place where people leapfrog, and where technology comes from, and where brain power is concentrated, and where innovation takes place. And if those sorts of statements could be made somewhere in, as you say, in the opening blurbs,
preamble, I think it's called, probably.
You know, or somewhere else in the document when they talk about mainstream, because mainstreaming will certainly be a very important theme in the GBF, as would their communication and outreach and marketing, you know. And I think in both the mainstreaming and that other one, the communications and marketing areas, cities are hugely enabling any implementation of any decision that is made in Kunming, you know. So, and I think the CBD parties have recognized that, and in some ways they're a bit further ahead in their thinking about that than the climate discussions, which often are much more complex, and you know, where division of powers and so on, and where the multi-level governance issues are more complicated. So yeah, but we certainly look forward to getting inputs like this. Very, very useful for me, certainly, and I hope for everybody that's listening in. But Tim, over to you.
Great, so thank you. And Harriet, before I give you a chance to, if you had a response to Kubi on that, I also just want to, you know, Kubi mentioned now the sort of post-2020 framework, which, you know, although the decision would be, you know, to support that and the role of local governments within that, I wanted to get a sense from you. I'm mindful of time and we're sort of running out of it at the moment, but get a sense from you whether or not you felt the 10-point framework we had presented was sort of on the right track, and also what, with your ear to the ground, what are the sort of conversations coming out in terms of what the content and scope of the post-2020 framework would actually look like? I don't know if you have any update on that. I know that, you know, everyone was sort of waiting with bated breath for a draft to emerge from Open-Ended Working Group 1. And that hasn't happened yet. So, you know, we have had some broad guidance on the scope and content. Yeah, but Harriet, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that you're aware of.
Yeah, I think you're probably just as up to date as I am. As you said, people have been waiting for the next iteration. I think there is definitely some challenge in trying to accommodate the sort of move towards nature's contribution to people, the kind of, you know, and a new agenda for people and the planet, alongside the more traditional concerns for biodiversity conservation and preservation. And I think it's in that space that some of the kind of tension about how do you actually realize all of those goals in the same time and create a biodiversity convention that can really achieve at multiple scales and for multiple ends. And I think it's maybe getting to be as complex as the climate arena has been over the last 10 years. So maybe it's a good thing that we haven't heard, actually, because maybe it means that the level of depth and discussion is sufficient to be making progress. Sometimes it's better if the discussion is long, because it means the issues are difficult and challenging but important. So I'm optimistic that we will get somewhere by February, but I think there is still a long way to go. I think in terms of and kind of feed that into the discussion that Kobe raised, I think one of the other key things on the mainstreaming is that we really found in our work so far that there is a really significant what we call opportunity gap between some of the policies which are coming from higher levels of government which focus on nature in relationship to climate and biodiversity and ecosystem services. Whereas when we see action on the ground, it's often connected to questions around urban regeneration, well-being, health, access to open space, and so on. And I think for the mainstreaming agenda, recognizing those benefits that nature has every day in the urban arena is going to be really important. And it's a question of, can that kind of agenda about the everyday value of nature and biodiversity be married with the important critical functions that biodiversity give us? And that's where I would like to see the convention going, is being able to capture both the everyday and the extraordinary. The question whether it can achieve that.
I just want to alert everybody that there is the zero draft out there that was put forward by the two co-chairs after Open-Ended Working Group 1, and that was published on on the 18th of July. And that basically what we heard there and what is captured in here is that people still feel the 2050 vision is intact and that one should keep that. And then in terms of the 2030 mission, they really, when they talk about goals and targets, they really introduced and reiterated the need for these targets to be smart targets, in other words, verifiable, etc., and achievable, etc. And then there was a general feeling that resource mobilization, mainstreaming, all these things need to be very, very high up on the agenda, but that the traditional NB-SUP method of reporting would probably remain with some additionalities or adjustments. And it's in those NB-SUPs where we feel from a local government perspective, that's one of the things that parties could consider, to almost make it mandatory to engage with their local and other levels of subnational government when putting these NB-SUPs together, and when reporting on the NB-SUPs, to feed from this information coming from the other levels of government. But these are early days, and as you say, there's lots to be done before we get to Kunming at the end of 2020.
So we are almost out of time, so I'm going to just give 1 minute to each of our panelists just to wrap up, and hopefully on a positive note. I want to sort of play with the idea of whether or not we think, 1 year until COP15, whether or not we think we are on track for the Paris moment for nature. And Harriet, I wonder if in your 1 minute closing, you would give some indication as to what you're hearing about whether or not the Aichi targets might stay and the thematic focus around that. So over to you, Harriet, and then we'll close with Kobe.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly the best report questions whether the Aichi targets are fit for purpose. There's a large body of scientific work now asking the question whether they really work, not only at the local level, but elsewhere. And so are they smart enough? And I think that may be something that's not yet resolved, and it will need to be resolved before we can move forward. In terms of are we on track? It's great to hear the 100 cities today. I think it would be great if we could be talking about more like 1,000 next year. Let's try that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's certainly the goal. And we are positive, with as more and more partners come on board and ourselves. And before I hand over to Kobe to close, I just wanted to mention some of the joint work that ICLEI is doing with a range of partners, including Harriet and Naturevation and Durham, around the commitment platform. So these 100 cities and many more, the network is growing by the day. We are in the process of designing this commitment platform that has been mentioned, which will firstly provide a basis for setting a baseline from cities, and will also allow cities, in line with the IP base, in line with the conversations that are happening around the sort of scope and content of the post-2020 framework and the need for a decision. This platform will allow cities to engage and set targets, set commitments, make clear the targets and commitments they've already established. And then Cities with Nature will provide a sort of ongoing monitoring and evaluation space for this to happen in a very dynamic way. So on that, this is a bit of a watch this space. We're working on finalizing that commitment platform. It's obviously determined on a lot of moving parts. But I think from me, I just want to really thank Harriet for being with us today. And Harriet will also be in the panel this afternoon alongside, we'll have a bit of a bigger panel this afternoon with some really exciting guests with us. But Harriet, thank you. We continue to value and we are so grateful for your support in this process. And thanks for joining us. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Kobe for her 1 minute. And Kobe, if you wouldn't mind closing the webinar for us. Thank you. And to everyone on the line, we look forward to welcoming you to the 8th webinar, which is likely to take place on the 5th of December. So over to you, Kobe.
Thank you. Thank you very much also, Tim, for organizing these webinars. They really do build up a body of discourse and also a body of very valuable information for all of us. What we will do in addition to the presentation, we will share this draft 0 on here. We will also share the 10-point framework on here in the days ahead. So please watch the space. And Tim, maybe you can just explain again where people can get hold of it. And the video, this will be recorded. The session will be different from this afternoon, so they will both be recorded and both be interesting to listen to afterwards. And please, I mean, this is just a call to everybody that's tuning in here. Reach to us. We want to hear from you. We want you to help shape whichever government or level of government you're from, or from civil society or business or wherever, please, we'd like to hear your inputs into what we should be saying as a constituency, and we're looking forward to talking with you again. In the meantime, if you're a city and you haven't yet joined Cities with Nature, today's a great day to do so. It's the World's Cities Day, and it's free and easy to join. And you can go along the journey and upload your information and learn and share from others immediately, but at a pace and in a way that suits you. So there are many choices for you. There's no prescriptive tools that you have to use, no prescriptive deadlines you have to reach at any time, because as Harriet says, cities all do it their own way, and Cities with Nature is specifically built in a way to allow for that variance. So please join Cities with Nature. If you're not from a city, please go and encourage your city today to join. And we hope, as you say, Harriet, that when we get to Kunming at the end of 2020, that we're talking about thousands of cities collectively sharing, learning, and inspiring each other on the Cities with Nature platform. Thank you.
So thank you, everyone, and we will share these resources that have been mentioned, especially the local and subnational government engagement platform that houses the overview of all of the work that is being done, and it has a multitude of resources, and we will share that link. So with that, we close this webinar. We look forward to this afternoon, and thank you to everyone for joining, and happy World Cities Day.
Yeah, happy World Cities Day. Thank you.